Our next speaker is Katherine Riley. So while you're having lunch, she's going to talk about ALCF allocation programs.
Hey everybody, hi, welcome, and this, oh, thank you. And this will be a much lighter sort of overview for your lunch. And I'll touch a little bit on two topics, but dive actually more into insight than we often do sort of in these broad overview sort of allocation topics. You've already seen this slide, I'm sure, today, or something very similar to it, but it's relevant to the allocation programs and how we structure the awards mechanisms for the ALCF. The root of this, right, is that we are a national user facility. And as a result of that, really focusing as a national user facility on scientific projects that need supercomputers to do their problem, where they really can't do your problem anywhere else. So this is the thing we've heard a little bit about already. And as sort of driving from that, we have our flagship program, which is Insight. That awards 60% of the time. It is the one that's really wide open to any kind of open science. And I'll talk about that sort of in the last part of this, but spend the bulk of the time on it. There's two other programs we have, which are the ALCC program and the DD program. And I'm gonna basically reverse order and talk through these. But ALCC is run by our program sponsors in DOE, and the discretionary is probably a program you are mostly already familiar with, in the sense that many of you are using a DD today and might have your own DD already, but this is the getting started. These are the rapid access, smaller awards that allow you to get on the system and test and move forward. So the key thing to think about for the DD is think of it as like a first step award. It is not meant for production science. It's really meant for proving that you can do something, proving that you have material for a proposal. It is really on the Polaris side, really low tens of thousands of node hours, but they're also short duration, like 3 to 6 months. The premise of that is not to punish you, like by saying like you have to come back every 3 to 6 months, but in the larger award programs, we have mechanisms to sort of get input from you and feedback about how you are doing in your award, if you've got any problems. And so the 3 to 6 month time frame on these is really to make sure you come back, sort of give us a status, and we know how you're doing and if you need any help. For DD, this should be a short application process, right? You should be able to go apply and be done with the application in 20, 30 minutes. It's a few paragraphs that we're asking for. What we really are looking for in these is demonstrate that you need to get onto the ALCF for some reason, whether you're preparing a proposal or you're testing to determine whether you could prepare a proposal. But we're looking for that summary. It should not be long. Our goal is about a 2-week turnaround for you to get the decision and sort of start, if you don't already have an account, start the account process. ALCC, as I mentioned, is this 30% chunk of the resource. And this is mission driven. So what this means is that Oscar, our program sponsor in the Office of Science, runs this to support projects that align with DOE mission. I will say that this does not mean you have to be DOE funded. There are definitely ALCC projects that come in that are not DOE funded, but you need to align with some priority, right, that the DOE has set for some period of time. And these are 1-year awards, right? They're not like long-term awards, although they're definitely repeat PIs, and this has been sort of fine within this program. And they're normally of a more modest size than Insight. So this is like the 10,000 to 200,000 these are all sort of approximate numbers, but that range for Polaris. The Aurora numbers, any Aurora number you see up here is like draft, right? Where, yes, we can do the calculations, but the realistic sort of history of those numbers, of course, there is no history. So just take that with a grain of salt when you're seeing what that might look like for Aurora. It's really speculation. But the process for this starts in a few weeks, if this is something that is interesting to you. So the letters of intent are due to Oscar in November, and starting in November. The call for that goes out, and they're normally due before the end of the year holidays. So hopefully nobody is writing them like on New Year's Eve. That was their goal, to avoid that. That happened one year. It was I think tough for people. But keep your eye open for them if that is something that is interesting to you. You are informed of that award in the springtime, late springtime normally, and the year cycle is the end of June to 1 year to July. Sorry, the beginning of July 1 year to the end of June of the next year. So it's a 6-month shift from the calendar year. But what I want to actually talk to you a little bit more about, because I can get into this in more detail, right, is Insight. And also because it really is the flagship, and it is where you are going to find, right, the biggest chunk of time available for your science. And again, I go back to sort of one of these broad overview slides because it's relevant, right? What we are looking for in Insight is open science that really can't be done elsewhere. High impact science, right, that really needs large scale computing and can't go forward without it. And computing here is sort of used this catch-all, right? It could be that you need access to the leadership computing to do something impactful because you need access to their data resources or something novel about the hardware that you're interested in exploring, but fundamentally that you need access to these large-scale systems to move forward. And I'm gonna move past this slide and actually just have this as reference for you, because I'm gonna get into all of these aspects of what eligibility is and what the review process looks like in order to give you what I'm going to call it's like the 5-minute version of a more detailed webinar that the program runs twice in the spring, but to give you a sense of what you really need to think about when you are developing a proposal. So the first thing is eligibility criteria. Who can apply for Insight? And truthfully, right, anyone can apply for Insight. There are a very few limitations we have. These are really rooted in like whether we can get you access to the system. So for example, we cannot put on people from state sponsors of terrorism, anyone who is a citizen of a state sponsor of terrorism, we cannot put those on the system. And that's kind of where the limitations kind of end. But for criteria, we're looking primarily whether there is a project that needs the resources of Insight to be successful, and will do so delivering high impact science. You do not need to have any US-based funding. You do not need to be in a US-based institution even to compete. So we have international PIs as well as domestic. We have PIs at universities and at national labs, et cetera. I will say that this is really mandated, right? So when the LCFs were created, it was actually created by the DOE High-End Computing and Revitalization Act in 2004, and that was the trigger for the 2 LCFs to be created. And one of the requirements of these is that they were national user facilities and that they have merit-based access to getting, awards. And this is what Insight is. There's a twofold review process for Insight. The most important, and to some degree, I would like to say the only one I would want to talk about, because I don't want to dissuade you from the importance of it. The most important is the peer review of the proposals. The scientific or technical merit of your proposal makes or breaks the proposal. You can be 100% technically ready, right, to use Polaris, for example, or Aurora, right? Your code can run beautifully, but if you haven't made a case for the scientific or technical merit, you will not get an award. And that's really a function of how we do these awards. So what we do, we actually just did this a few weeks ago, is we have science panels where the proposals are compared, right? So we're not necessarily comparing a biology proposal, say, and an engineering proposal. So we have subgroups that are comparing like-to-like proposals and looking for those that are most meritorious. They're also evaluating, right, in those merit criteria, things like, are they using methods that make sense, right? Are the methods appropriate? Is the amount of time for the methods that people are choosing, does that make sense? Does that align? And is the right team in place? And these are the type of conversations that we're having at these panels when we're assessing the proposal. There is a computational readiness review, which is really a technical assessment, which is why it's written as technical assessment up there. It is to determine the risk factor for this proposal, and is really used internally by the ALCF to determine, okay, we want to award this project because the scientific merit is really high. is, do we need to put a lot of people to work with this project, right? Do we expect this to be something very collaborative to make them successful? Or is this something where they're ready to go and we expect that they're going to go January 1st and don't need much assistance? That's the kind of driver behind the technical readiness. As I said, it's a risk assessment. It's not the deciding factor. It's our way of determining, the effort component of supporting a proposal. Because I'll point out that when we go through deciding on insight between the ALCF and the OLCF, part of what we're considering here is all of the experts. So of course, we've got the room populated by ALCF staff, right? Both computational scientists, computer scientists, performance engineers. And when you are an insight project, you have one or sometimes multiple people working with you, right? That's one of the commitments through insight, is that you have this potential collaborator at the facility to help you. So both of these reviews happen for every proposal, the most crucial being the scientific merit. Then we also have the computational readiness review, the technical assessment, and that's all folded in, as I mentioned, to the decision process. And the decision process is really driven by the Insight program manager and the directors for both facilities, and then senior management, like the directors of science. And it is really this balance of looking at the meritorious proposals and really trying to find a balanced portfolio that we can actually support with the humans that we have, along with fitting in with the constraints of the system. One thing that might be relevant for some folks in the room is that Insight does have an early career path. This is not necessarily a different path. You go through the exact same application process. It's just that when you apply, you check a box that says, I got my PhD within the past 10 years. We created this to really let people early in their career know that they had a place to land. And this was driven by conversations with younger PIs who just kind of felt, well, like, all right, I know my previous advisor and these other two collaborators of theirs are submitting proposals, and I know how hard that might be to compete against, right? And they felt like maybe they weren't going to try to do that and submit and compete. So we wanted to help reduce that barrier. So what we do with Insight is commit up to 10% of allocatable hours to those within their first 10 years of getting their PhD. It can help you get an award in the sense that if we're looking at the portfolio and we realize that we don't have, a good representation from early career path folks, we might dig a little bit deeper in the meritorious projects than we would have otherwise. But I will say, we did this, and we did this 3 years ago. So this is our 3rd year of doing this, and I have to say that consistently, the early career proposals need very little digging to bring up. They're very competitive, right? They are ranking top of these panels. They are doing extremely well. So I will just submit that to consider, that we are going to keep this because I think it's important for people to realize that they have a place to come and that we want early career people to apply. But I think the really good news is that, right, proposal crafting is proposal crafting. And if you write a good proposal, you can be very competitive. I wanted to touch on a couple things that I think are valuable to think about if you're considering applying an Insight Award. And there are things that the reviewers are looking for. Although they're not asked these specific questions, the questions we do ask them are really steering them in this direction, right? And making sure that these are checked along with other things. And these, I can walk through each and every one of them, but I think it will take a little bit of time, but I encourage you to look at these and consider them as you're working through the process of perhaps applying. And if you have, no to any of these, it's not necessarily an end, right? It's complicated. If you are looking through this and you're not really sure if you have the people ready to go, and there's another set of questions, right? Or you don't understand the life cycle of your data, talk to the center of your interest, talk to us, right? We can help you work through that, right? This is one of the things we can do. And we can't necessarily provide you with the funding to do that, right? But we can provide you with some guidance, and we can even provide you with guidance in terms of how you could articulate that within the proposal. But one thing, because I've talked a lot about the scientific or technical merit of these proposals, but things that people sometimes forget are even aspects of, say, the workflow you might have for your project, right? So sometimes the traditional sort of historical, like, common workflow 25 years ago is I have a big campaign, I'm going to generate a bunch of data, my postdoc's going to take that data and put it somewhere else, and then somebody else is going to help me like analyze that. And of course that it exists today, but it is not as ubiquitous, and workflows are pretty complicated. So for example, have you tested whatever your workflow solution is? That's a really important one, to make sure that if you've got something more complicated that you're trying to execute, that not just that your application codes might execute, but that your workflow executes too. I'm not trying to harp on that one alone, but I just pull that one out as one that we see frequently in the review process, that someone has prepared, say they're individual scientific applications, but the workflow isn't quite there. And so we're looking at a really big award, unsure how they're going to execute it because the workflow isn't tested. And testing that workflow is a really great place for a discretionary award, for example. But ask these questions and really contemplate whether, if there's any no's, reach out to us and we can give you some guidance on, whether, oh no, this is fine, you can keep going given what you have, or come back. Here are some other aspects of guidance I want to give you in sort of thinking about how you write your proposal. The first one is very relevant right now. And so this is just a cartoon slide really on this chart on your right. Sorry, I was trying to get my left and my right straight. And what this is really indicating is that the life cycle of a supercomputer indicates kind of how many projects or the acceptance rate you're likely to see come into a center, come into ALCF or OLCF through Insight. When a system first comes online, we want more adopters, right? We want people to get on, we want people to explore, we want people to build up their science in many cases, right? And we often have a much higher acceptance rate within Insight than near the end of the life cycle of a system, where the acceptance rate sort of drops off, right? So after the first couple of years, the acceptance rates start dropping off, and in that last year, it's brutal. The last year acceptance rate, for example, for Theta was tough. Like, it's very hard to turn away projects, right? But it's very competitive. A lot of people are very ready, and people are asking for very aggressive, like large awards, right? So that drops off. So I bring this up because we see this happening right now, that we're in a high acceptance rate period. Frontier is finishing its first mostly full year at OLCF. Aurora is entering into Insight, and you can expect to see acceptance rates be a lot higher, but not permanently, right? So this is just, if you're almost there, right, it's a decent time to push and try to get your foot in and compete for an award. So that's one thing I wanted to sort of bring up. Right, that there's a natural life cycle and acceptance rates within these proposals. It's not static, right, where it's 25% all the time. What could it, it's on average 30%, right? I would say that really when we hit sort of a steady state with the system, it's always oscillating around that 25 to 30%, but it is not stable, and it is not, it's very inconsistent, right, because of that life cycle. So going back to sort of some other aspects of guidance, as I've already harped on, the scientific or technical merit is the thing that makes or breaks the proposal. And so why I bring that back up is think about the reviewers when you're writing these proposals. We do not have sort of an infinite pool of reviewers. And what we do is we get perhaps like 10 to 15 people in a room to talk about the proposals. So you can expect that your reviewer will be an expert in sort of the higher level domain that you're working in, the higher level field that you're working in, but they might not be an expert in your subspecialty. And we see this often as a mistake when people are writing their Insight proposals, because even very smart and accomplished people are trying to connect dots in the proposal, and that makes it very difficult to review the proposal. So connect dots. That might seem silly to say, but it's very true, and is a common pitfall we see within Insight. Make it very clear what the scientific or technical problem you're working on and trying to solve is, and connect the dots about how you're going to accomplish that. And don't even necessarily assume, like most of the reviewers do go do their homework, right? And they look up previous papers and they look at previous accomplishments from a particular PI, but try to put that within the scope of Insight is a 15-page proposal. Try to work that in there in a coherent way. The other component that I really want to encourage people to think about is be careful about the prerequisites, right, for starting a proposal and making sure that's clear in the proposal itself. So are you waiting for data to come in? Are there preliminary runs that you will have to do elsewhere, or even just like, in the first 3 months, I need to do, these configuration or parameter sweeps to figure out what the big thing is, making those very clear, very important. And the other one is, frankly, follow the guidelines that we have. Like, we provide a lot of information on, and I'll point you to the websites for Insight. We provide a lot of information for the structure of your proposal and what to put in it. And I encourage you to look at those carefully and to follow them. We host 2 webinars in the spring. The call opens in April, plus or minus like mid-April, plus or minus a few days. And once those are announced, we announce dates we pre-announce dates for the webinars. We do this before we open the call, but we have 2 webinars where we walk through the proposal in depth, right? And we encourage people to ask whatever questions they might have about, even very specifically about what their proposal might do to like fit within the Insight proposal framework. And as I sort of mentioned already, right, fundamentally all this translates to is proposal craft is key. Like, writing a good proposal is really key here. And don't be surprised if you have to iterate 1 or 2 years to get Insight. I mean, we absolutely find PIs who are rejected 1 year, they come back the next year having addressed the criticisms that the panel found in their proposal and are very competitive the next year and are often successful. And this is partly even due to the fact that we have memory in our panels, right? We don't necessarily have the exact same people every year, but we always try to have some repeat people, right? So there's memory. This is the problem when I talked with my hands and a microphone there. I won't talk too much to this. This is to give you sort of a sense of just award time. Like, if you're looking at Polaris, the kind of scale of awards that people are looking at. And as I said, draft times for Aurora, you can go back and look at this for reference as you're trying to think about what is a reasonably normal award, right? Or a competitive award. But the reason I'm skipping it is I also wanted to talk a little bit about statistics, right? Some history from the Insight, so you can sort of maybe map that and use that in your own planning thoughts. So here are 2 years, 23 and 24, 23, excuse me, and 22. So the past 2 years of Insight. We are just finishing the 24 awards. So in the early November, we'll be announcing those awards for 2024. Last year was the last year for Summit and Theta, perhaps, obviously, if you knew that, but for Frontier and Polaris, I think Polaris is the most illustrative of sort of the trends of what we are likely to see on Polaris in terms of total number of projects, which is just 12, right? It's not the biggest system, and we're looking for high impact problems that tend to need a decent chunk of time. And we're talking about average awards, right, in this 160,000 node hour size. But again, this ranges from projects that were peak at around 300,000 node hours to, I think the smallest is 50,000, but that's very, very small. We don't award very many small Insights. 100,000 is really sort of the more consistent, smaller size. And as I mentioned, I have these working numbers for Aurora, but they're working, right? They're really draft. And that will become more clear in the next year, what we're going to award and what we are seeing in terms of trends. The other thing to note from this is that you absolutely can request multiple resources, right? This is very, very common. So we have projects that request every single resource in Insight, and people who request like just Frontier and Polaris, for example. This is a model we have. So just keep that in mind as well. If there's something that is working better out on one type of architecture, you can split up your ask across multiple. You can also ask for development time. This is also a common question we ask. So let's say you have a large campaign, you're trying to focus on Polaris, but you want to do some perhaps aggressive testing on Aurora in 2025. This is something you can consider and fold into the proposal and ask. Some other statistics, as I had mentioned, we have a pretty, I would say like a not surprising distribution of where PIs come from. And the primary location for PIs is US-based universities. That's a big yellow chunk up there at 62%. And foreign PIs at 7%. And then the government wedge there is, I haven't come up with a better term for it, but it's really referring to like national labs, other government agencies like NASA or NIH, things like that. And then a small slice of industry. So industry does apply, industry can be competitive. We encourage industry projects. It just doesn't tend to be the biggest slice that we see. Our oversubscription rate is also something to consider, right? This has to do with really what the competition is looking like. We were across all of the systems in 23, 2x oversubscribed, which is a really big dip from our historical numbers, right? If you looked at this over time, you'd see that normally we're more like 5 times oversubscribed. Polaris for 2024 call, for example, was 5.5 times oversubscribed. But yet like newer systems are far less oversubscribed, right? Because this just all has to do with who's ready and, you know, getting those proposals ready to compete. So this was a dip. There's a lot of reasons for that dip, and it really had to do with a lot of systems coming online that people like Frontier and Polaris actually people hadn't gotten access to. And so the asks were really kind of diminished. But you should expect historically that does not necessarily go through big cycles with the life cycle of a system. That's normally really more consistently at this 5x. And we see a return for that. That's a preview of 24 statistics. We see a return to that. There were 56 total projects for all of Insight in 23. That's a pretty consistent number too. We're pretty much normally around that. This is the number though that does change. You'll see some spikes probably in the total counts as the new systems come on. The other really relevant thing is that new proposals are very competitive. New PIs are very competitive. And I want to emphasize that. So for 23, 50% of new proposals, so they were not a renewal proposal, because you can ask for 1, 2, or 3 year in Insight. This was a new proposal. 50% of those were accepted, which is great. That is, again, a reflection of this, you know, rise in acceptance rate. You see more historically like that, look at 30% or so, but that is still very competitive. I mean, that's still very good in the sense that you do have a very good chance. You do not have to be the historic PI who's got, you know, consecutive insights coming through. New PIs are very competitive. If you want to dig through, and not even dig through, but work through the Insight information, DOEleadershipcomputing.org is the primary site for Insight. It has our templates, for example, for the proposal. It has the historical webinars, so you can go get a sense of those, right? The primary thing that changes in those webinars from year to year are specifics on the systems. So, I mean, that's one big thing that changes. And the second thing, primary, that changes is if there's any new guidance for a particular year. Like the year we introduced the early career path, we incorporated that a little bit more as a highlight within in the webinar. But the bulk of this stays the same because the bulk of what we're looking for is consistent. So even looking at these webinars, the historical ones have value in terms of thinking and planning ahead. As I mentioned, the templates are also there. There's a FAQ, and it can kind of just walk you through and give you a very concrete sense of what we're looking for and allows you to sort of mess with all of that information before the call opens. You don't need to wait for the call to open in April. What primary happens when the call opens is we just clarify we're awarding these systems. And we don't even list the exact amount of time we're awarding on those systems. That's decided later, right? So that's the only real special thing come April, at least from year to year. I will tell you, as currently wearing the hat for the Insight Program Manager at the moment, I don't plan any great surprises for the next call, the one for 2025. Although I still hold the right to have a surprise, but right now it's going to look like a very consistent year because introducing new systems and then changing things dramatically at the same time is not very friendly. So looking at this is very relevant to applying in the 25 and even future years. And this I will leave as a slide as a reference for you. I think people have found this historically valuable as just like the quick comparison chart to give you a sense of what the differences are. And I think this is really mostly relevant if you're contemplating ALCC versus Insight. Frankly, like the 2 sentences I'll give if you're trying to compare and contrast the two and figure out which one is most relevant is if you think something that aligns with, you have something that aligns with DOE mission, it can be worthwhile applying to that. It's not so much that it's a black box, but it is a little bit different, right? These are the program managers at DOE making these decisions. So, if you've got a good in with a program manager, this is that can be a reliable path to consider. But those awards, as I said, are smaller. They are limited to a year. And the feedback can be different. We try to give you a substantial amount of feedback with Insight so that you can come back and really compete and improve proposals. And it's not to say that ALCC fights that, right? But our goal with Insight is to do that, to get you to come back and try to recompete if you aren't successful in a particular year. And with ALCC, they aren't necessarily cultivating that as aggressively. So I feel like now ALCC program manager is going to come at me a little bit, but that is one thing to consider there. And so that was my high-speed run through with this. Often in this talk, I spend a little bit more time describing every single program in detail, but the ALCF and the OLCF, we jointly run Insight. We understand Insight very well. We know every last bit of this. I have spent the last 3 months almost only exclusively getting the reviews for 2024 done and working through for that process, right? So there's a team here and we understand that. And it is our flagship program. So I really wanted to give you a little bit more than what you would see on this website, but some insight of things that we see consistently, right? That can help you be successful, or that, we see as common pitfalls with Insight. And maybe that might even trigger more questions in your head. And that was all I wanted to touch on. But depending on what I'm allowed, if there are questions, I will be here for a little bit longer, but you can also reach out to me on email.
Thank you, Katherine.